Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for July 10th, 2024. Today I'm going to be discussing the split in the world between the NATO summit going on in Washington, D.C., presided over by Joe Biden, and the emergence in Eurasia of a new security and development architecture, which the so-called geniuses of the West seem to wish to forget about, or if they don't talk about it, maybe it won't exist. The reality is that the Biden was on display yesterday trying to show that he's not demented. And under what he presented does raise questions that perhaps he's not physically sick, but he's mentally disoriented and should not be in the position he's in as President of the United States. He said that NATO under his direction has never been stronger. Now, his speech exposed his delusional state of mind. He said that NATO is unified and committed to defend Ukraine, and he said he's responsible for that. He said Putin's desire to reconstruct the Soviet Union has been stopped because of him. And due to NATO and his leadership, Ukraine will win the war against Russia, he said. Now, as you know, the word of the last couple of weeks when it's come to Biden to describe him is that he's suffering from dementia. I can't confirm this, but it certainly seems to be a legitimate diagnosis from watching him perform in public. But a review of the West as a whole, with the tumultuous elections, unhappy and angry voters, the shrinking economy, the full commitment, in spite of these problems, to continuing the wars, it seems that all the leaders of the West seem to be suffering from dementia. Now, one form of this is the refusal to even comment on the historic developments in Eurasia. This is classic British imperial geopolitics from the beginning of the 20th century. The idea that the greatest threat to the British Empire is an integration of the nations stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, especially the need to separate Central Europe from Russia, that is Germany from Russia. Now the geopolitical thinking dominates the Anglo-American establishment. The same outlook that goes back to the great game in the 19th century, that has been responsible for the two world wars in the 20th century and is pushing us to the brink of a third world war, comes from the City of London and its co-thinkers from Washington and Wall Street. So what is it that's going on in Eurasia, which the establishment is trying to suppress through war and to try to cover up so you don't know it's happening? We do know that there were some very significant developments in the last days, with Hungary's President Viktor Orban going to visit Putin and Xi Jinping, with Indian Prime Minister Modi going to Moscow, and in particular, the diplomacy initiated by Putin, which he's discussed as a new Eurasian security architecture. So let's just review it briefly. You start with something called the Shanghai Cooperation 10. It's now 10 members because Belarus has joined. They just had a meeting in Astana, and they issued a declaration from it, which is, as you'll hear, quite reasonable. They said they wish to increase their role in the creation of a new democratic, fair, political, and economic international order. And to do that, they're moving to create an investment fund, create a Shanghai Cooperation Organization bank that would be like the new development bank of the BRICS. They're defining themselves as the basis for a new security architecture in Eurasia. And this conforms with Putin's discussion of linking security in Europe and Asia and linking that to economic development. Now, what Putin talked about in a series of speeches during June leading up to this conference was the idea of bilateral and multilateral agreements open to all Eurasian countries. And he said, including NATO countries. And he said that there's a military and financial dynamic to it, that there must be no military presence of external powers in Eurasia. Well, think about Afghanistan. Think about the idea of the Indo-Pacific deployment of NATO and so on. That's what he's talking about. And then he's also talking about an economic alternative to Western, what he called Western-controlled economic mechanisms, expanding the use of national currencies in settlements and establishing independent payment systems. Why is that a threat? It represents a rejection of this arbitrary notion of a rules-based order, with the rules written by the Western bankers and financial interests to protect themselves at the expense of sovereign nations. That's the threat, and that's what scares them about Putin. The idea of a fair, just economic order? Well, what Putin said is that his idea is based on, quote, a commitment of sovereign states to mutually beneficial partnerships, unquote. Now, the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization include Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, Belarus now, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. That's 10 countries. But their dialogue partners that were attending this meeting in Astana include Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Azerbaijan. The memberships of the SCO make up 80% of the Eurasian landmass, 40% of the world's population, and 25% of global GDP, and a significant portion of the oil and gas reserves in the world. So this is a very big deal, a very large economic and security partnership. And the discussions that they had included especially Russian-Chinese cooperation in transportation infrastructure and energy, including the development of the Siberia 2 gas pipeline. So why is this a threat? Well, if you're clinging to the idea that the only legitimate economic direction for the world is the maintenance of a unipolar order in which economic policy is dictated by the Western banks, including the central banks and financial institutions, for the benefit of those institutions, which, by the way, are heavily indebted, including with derivative obligations, incapable of rolling over the debt, requiring constant bailouts. It's a system that's run out of steam. It's a system that's collapsing because of its internal contradictions. And what's necessary with that system is to put it into bankruptcy reorganization and then turn toward the physical economic growth of Eurasia and become partners with that. That's what would make sense. Instead, we see the problem of dementia, and not just, as I said, in Joe Biden. So the threat comes not from Eurasia, but from the necessity to protect the predatory rules-based order and defend it from sovereign nations that are yearning for economic development. This is a catastrophic situation for the West because it means that very significant sums of money will be directed to weapons that will be engaged in destroying nations and will ultimately force a situation where the West will have to decide whether it's going to send its young people to fight and die or not. Instead, it's time to take seriously rejecting the geopolitical doctrine of Mackinder, which is the ghost that's directing, it's the hand that's directing the NATO summit. Get rid of that ghost and enter into cooperation and collaboration. The question then is, will the nations of Eurasia accept the partnership from the West? Well, what Putin said is, if you give up your hegemonic desires, we could be partners. Now, I'll be discussing this tomorrow with Helga Zepp-LaRouche on today. I'll be discussing it this afternoon with her on our weekly dialogue, which starts at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And you can get the link from the description box. So I hope you'll take advantage of that and join us for that discussion.